Chapter 1. A pleasant day turned grim. It had been, up until that point, a morning so perfectly English that it might have been painted. The sky was a modest blue, with clouds drifting like sheep over the gentle rise of the downs. A soft breeze wandered through the gardens of St. Mildred's Lane, carrying the scent of lavender and fresh-mown grass. The occasion was Mrs. Penelope Harcourt's annual summer tea, a rather grand name for what was in truth an assortment of sponge cakes, sandwiches with the crust removed, and the opportunity for the women of St. Mary Mead to wear their best hats. Mrs. Harcourt's lawn was the pride of the village, a wide green sweep bordered by peonies and neatly clipped box hedges. On that day, tables with crisp white cloths and gleaming china stood ready for guests. Miss Marple had been invited, of course. She sat at the edge of one of the tables, in a pale summer hat adorned with discreet cluster of violets, quietly sipping her tea. She listened, as she always did, to the ebb and flow of conversation. The little half-truths, the too careful denials, the sly nods toward some private matter best not aired in public. Beside her, Mrs. Hartnell was in full swing, expounding on extraordinary behavior of Mr. Russell, the new lodger at the vicarage, a man his age and never married, and the hours he keeps, well, one wonders. Miss Marple murmured something politely noncommittal, though she noted Mrs. Hartnell's keen interest in whether Mr. Russell had been seen near the High Street on Tuesday evening. It was shortly after the sponge cake had been served that the garden's easy chatter shifted into an uneasy murmur. Harriet Harcourt, Mrs. Harcourt's youngest daughter, had gone upstairs to fetch an embroidered cushion to show to Mrs. Price Ridley, who was admiring the needlework on the table mats. She returned moments later, her face pale and her voice wavering. "Mama," she said, I think there's something wrong with Mrs. Bartlett." Mrs. Bartlett was a widow of modest means, who lived in a small cottage just beyond the post office. She was a friend of Mrs. Harcourt's late sister, and had been staying for a few days, ostensibly to rest after a bout of ill health. She had been given the guest bedroom on the upper floor, the one with the pleasant view of the garden. Miss Marple noticed, even before anyone moved, how the mood changed. Mrs. Harcourt set down her teacup rather sharply. Mrs. Price Ridley gave a quick, almost furtive glance at Miss Marple before looking away. Mrs. Hartnell began to tut, though in eager curiosity that ill-disguised her anticipation of news. Mrs. Harcourt, Harriet, and, because she was nearest, Miss Marple herself went upstairs together. The guest room was airy, with chintz curtains billowing slightly in the summer breeze. The bedspread was pulled halfway back, as though its occupant had meant to rise but thought better of it. Mrs. Bartlett lay upon the pillow, her face turned slightly to one side, her eyes half open but unseeing. The scent in the room was faint yet distinct, a delicate floral perfume, out of place in the daylight, mingled with something sharper, harder to name. Harriet gasped, clutching her mother's arm. Mrs. Harcourt, pale but practical, moved to the bed. She's not breathing," she said, in a voice both shocked and incredulous. Miss Marple stepped forward, her expression grave, her eyes noting the untouched glass of water on the bedside table, the half-emptied small bottle of sleeping draught beside it, and the way the pillow beneath Mrs. Bartlett's head seemed just slightly displaced, as though someone had shifted it recently. The faint scent lingered, a whisper in the air, enough to stir a memory from long ago of a similar room, a similar stillness. In the hall, footsteps pounded upward, one of the younger Harcourt boys sent to fetch the doctor. Downstairs, the murmuring of the guests had thickened into a low, humming unrest, as if the garden itself had grown uneasy. Miss Marple said nothing. Not yet. She stood quietly, her mind already beginning to sift the scene, not with the urgency of the police, but with the patience of one who knew that in every tragedy lay a story, hidden, intricate, and human. And as she looked once more at Mrs. Bartlett's still form, her gaze lingered, just for a moment, on the pillow beneath the woman's head. Something about it, something in its scent, was wrong. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts Gossip and Theories. By the time Dr. Haydock's motor pulled up before the Harcourt house and the maid had flown down the steps to meet him, the garden had developed a new climate, no longer mild and social, but close and thunderous, alive with whispers that rolled and broke like small, eager waves. Guests who had been on the point of departing found reasons to linger. Saucers chimed softly as teacups were set down with unnecessary care, and the scent of roses seemed suddenly excessive, as if it, too, were trying a little too hard. Mrs. Hartnell, that inveterate recorder of other people's news, had strategically shifted to a chair with an advantageous view of the hall. She was neither so coarse as to stand with her ear to the stair rail, nor so modest as to avert her gaze entirely. "A rest cure," she murmured to Mrs. Price Ridley, with the solemn triumph of a prophecy fulfilled. "And this is what comes of it. Rest cures, in my experience, conceal more than they mend. One thinks of that dreadful business at Waverley House." Mrs. Price Ridley, who disliked conceding the conversational floor to anyone, even in tragedy, inclined her head. "Poor Mrs. Bartlett. Such a fragile creature," she said, choosing her last words with the faintest pause, as if fishing in a shallow stream for the most convenient fish. "And yet I have always observed that fragility, when cultivated, has a way of influencing those around it, especially men. Such consideration it demands." "Men," breathed Mrs. Hartnell, exasperated and satisfied at once. "There you have it. Mr. Russell, for instance. He passed this very gate not an hour before the tea. I saw him from the corner of my eye while I was speaking to Mrs. Clement. He had that look about him, thwarted, as if prevented from doing a thing, and sulking about it." Miss Marple, who had returned to the garden with Mrs. Harcourt's consent once Dr. Haydock took charge upstairs, sat quietly in the shade and let the words come and go. She saw, rather than heard, the doctor's brisk, contained movements in the landing mirror, the housemaid's anxious hands wringing a damp napkin to a rope, Harriet's pale face set with a younger woman's determination to be helpful. What was said would be predictable. A careful declaration of death, the suggestion of a slight delay while matters were formalized, a few firm instructions. What mattered to Miss Marple for the present was not the medical certainty, but the social uncertainty, which puckered the surface of things and showed, if one looked, the threads beneath. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, earnest and fluttering, approached Mrs. Harcourt and pressed both her hands with straightforward sympathy. "My dear, what a trial! You mustn't think of us. We shall go at once. Only say if there is anything at all we may do." "Thank you," said Mrs. Harcourt, who was not a woman to invite pity. Her self-possession was frayed but intact, and her voice had the briskness of someone taking control of the only thing she could, appearance. "Harriet, tell cook to send Mr. Williams a basket for the constable. He'll be wanting something. Miss Marple, might I impose? The arrangement of the guests." "Of course," Miss Marple said, with that little smile which soothed industrious women. "A gentle dispersal. It will be best." She moved among them as one might move through a bed of shy flowers, not brusquely, never with the air of ushering people out, but with soft remarks about the heat, the need to let the family collect itself, the shock of the unforeseen. Almost everyone responded to the tact of it. Almost. There were always two or three who found a pressing reason to delay, their consciences pinned to the hedges by curiosity. Miss Marple did not dislodge them. Their lingering, too, was a kind of information. At the gate, Mr. Pritchard, who ran the ironmonger's, stood with his bicycle, speaking in a low voice to Tom Biddle, the Harcourt's gardener. "It's the draughts, I say," Mr. Pritchard confided, with the air of a man rehearsing a verdict. "All those medicines folk take nowadays. One never knows what's in them. A label can say what it likes." Tom, a fair, anxious fellow with thoughtful hands, set his cap back and frowned. "She weren't the sleeping sort," he said, almost himself. "Resting, the missus said. But when a person lies very quiet, it isn't always sleep. I took the morning up there to sweep off the balcony. She thanked me, soft as a dove." "So you were on the balcony?" Miss Marple asked, as though she had happened upon them by accident, and not by an instinct as trained as any pointer's. "Before or after the tea began?" "Before, miss," Tom said, coloring at being addressed so directly by a lady he had long respected as a repository of the village's good sense. "About 11. Her window was open. A scent out of there, like flowers tight shut in a glass bottle. If you take me." Miss Marple nodded, filing it away. A scent is the most innocent thing in the world, she thought, and also the most revealing. Women, after all, learn to speak with it. A dab for gaiety, a veil for sorrow, and sometimes a mask for fear. She remembered a girl at the lace mending in her youth who had taken to a certain jasmine water whenever her courting went wrong. There had been a broken engagement and a very unfortunate footman. One could read the whole story by the smell she wore. As more people drifted to the lane, the hub of speculation shifted towards the post office, that practical heart of St. Mary Mead where envelopes and opinions were weighed with similar briskness. By 3 o'clock, under the polite tyranny of routine, the afternoon mail was still sorted. Mrs. Finch, the postmistress, possessed the tact of someone who could keep a dozen secrets without developing the indigestion of one. Yet even she allowed, in a voice pitched to seem accidental, that Mrs. Bartlett had received a letter that morning, with a hand she did not recognize. "A foreign stamp?" asked Mr. Pritchard, ablaze with the romance of it. "Oh, nothing so melodramatic," Mrs. Finch replied, gently cool. "A perfectly ordinary stamp. Only the script, neat, a woman's, I should say, and a nice paper. Cream. From a friend," Mrs. Clement offered. "Or a relation?" "Her relations, as I understand it, are thin on the ground," Mrs. Finch said. "But people have acquaintances for all sorts of purposes." At which 2 customers, who had no immediate business in stamps, became intensely occupied with the picture postcards. Miss Marple, who had stepped in for a half-ounce of knitting wool, it was never unwise to replenish these things, allowed the slightest crease of concern to touch her brow. A letter in the morning and death in the afternoon. It meant nothing by itself. Many people received letters without dying, but then many people did not die with a strange scent on their pillow and a bottle of draft untouched beside the bed. Across the green, at the grocer's, an alternative theory was enjoying its hour of sunshine. Mr. Tapp, whose eggs were a matter of faith with his customers, maintained stoutly that the heat had been too much. "A feint turns to the stopping of the heart," he declared. "You see it in hens. You pick 'em up, and their little engines just stop. Shock, that's what it is. Perhaps bad news in a letter." "Or good," said his wife unexpectedly, setting down a crate of tomatoes. "Sometimes good news breaks a heart more swiftly than bad. Imagine a thing hoped for long, and then it comes and it is too late." The poetic suggestion hung in the shop like a sprig of thyme, out of place but fragrant. Miss Marple observed the way customers received it. Some with a smile, some with annoyance, hope and disappointment. She thought, did peculiar things to people. They made saints tired and sinners industrious. Back at the Harcourt house, in the quiet after the dispersal, Dr. Haydock came down with the expression of a man closing a drawer on which he would later write a label. "A sudden end," he told Mrs. Harcourt, his voice precise and kind. "I have asked that the constable send a word to the inspector. Merely procedure, in such circumstances." "Of course," said Mrs. Harcourt, who had sat very straight for a very long time. She looked older by a handful of hours. "I am grateful." Harriet stood at the far end of the drawing-room, near the French doors, twisting a lace handkerchief that had belonged to her aunt. She was a pretty girl in a sensible way, with steady eyes that now would not quite settle. Miss Marple, joining her, made some remark about the lilies. Harriet answered too quickly, then flushed at her own eagerness, and then looked stricken at the impropriety of eagerness on such a day. "I only mean," she began and stopped, "I only mean that Mrs. Bartlett had been anxious. Mamma says she was delicate, but it was not only that. She asked me last night whether the guest-room door locked properly. She laughed when she asked. Oh, it sounded like a joke, but she watched my face to see how I would answer. Doors can be curious things, Miss Marple said, as if recalling some ancient domestic debate about drafts. Some shut and keep out what should come in. Others welcome what should remain out. And some are merely excuses for bad manners. She patted Harriet's hand. Did you find the scent in the room pleasant? Harriet blinked. I suppose so. Sweet. A little like... She hesitated. Do you know, that is odd. Mrs. Bartlett always said she disliked perfumes. She would sneeze if I wore my violet water. She called it frivolous. But the room smelled, well, like a dress shop in London. Ah, Miss Marple murmured. Shops have their reason for sweetness. When Inspector Beckett arrived from Much Benham at 4:30, a careful man with tidy hair and the conscientious sobriety of middle rank, he was met by a village already partitioned into factions of theory. He took possession of the small morning room with a notebook and a respectful manner toward the bereaved. He spoke with the doctor, the maid, and Tom Biddle, and he promised to be as unobtrusive as the law permitted. He was not a blusterer by nature, which disposed Miss Marple moderately in his favor. Mrs. Bartlett had been staying since Tuesday, he recited to her, after seeking her out with a mixture of wariness and relief that policemen often felt in her presence. She had not been robust. Rest ordered. She retired after luncheon complaining of a headache. Found dead at roughly 2:30. Doctor noncommittal, as is his way. There was a bottle of chloral, prescribed. Apparently, the glass on the bedside table contained only water. We shall need to make the routine inquiries. Of course, Miss Marple said, knitting already in her lap, the needles whispering like two old friends keeping a secret. You will find, Inspector, that routine in a village is never quite the same twice. It is the deviations that tell. One hardly notices them unless one likes people very much. He gave her a small, grave smile. I take your meaning, Miss Marple. I am told you noticed a scent. It is difficult to ignore what insists upon announcing itself, she replied mildly, and more difficult still to ignore what should be present and is not. Beckett's pencil paused. What should be present? She only smiled again, that small, domestic smile that meant nothing at all and quite a lot. You will forgive an old woman, Inspector. I sometimes think in laundry lists. One notices when a pillow smells of flowers, and one notices when a handkerchief does not, particularly if a lady sneezes at violet water. Outside, the first shadows of evening lengthened across the green, and the village adjusted itself with practiced resilience to the disturbance at its center. In the cottages and shops, at scullery sinks and on back steps, people rehearsed the day's astonishments in tones of pity or interest, adding their own small embellishments as hedgerows add small birds. Some mentioned a letter, others, a sound heard on the landing. Still others, a man seen walking quickly past a hedge and not looking up when his name was called. All of it, when poured into the village's great vessel of talk, made a broth at once nourishing and unreliable. Miss Marple, walking home at last with her straw bag on her arm and her hat set very straight, let their words strip away in the air like chaff. She did not despise gossip. It was a harvest of sorts. But she had learned long ago that in the busy mill of the small place the truth often arrived disguised as something ordinary, an absent-minded gesture, a lifted latch, a scent that lingered where it had no business lingering. The evening was mild and the thrushes sang, and far off a train stitched its faint iron line across the fields. Inside her neat sitting room, she set the kettle to boil, took down her favorite blue cup, and thought of pillows and perfumes, and the funny way a locked door can be mostly an idea. In the morning, there would be questions and perhaps answers and certainly more talk. For tonight, there was tea. And in the quiet between kettle and cup, Miss Marple reviewed the day with the same tidy affection with which she would fold a shawl, seeing where the edge did not meet, where a corner had been pulled, where a careless hand, someone's, had left a crease that would not smooth. Chapter 3. The First Clues and Suspicions. The morning after Mrs. Bartlett's death dawned pale and cool, a thin veil of mist clinging to the hedgerows, as though the village itself wished to keep its thoughts to itself. Yet inside St. Mary Mead, thoughts were anything but concealed. By 8 o'clock, the post office, the grocer's, and even the vicarage kitchen were quietly humming with fresh theories. Inspector Beckett had returned early, as had Dr. Haydock, and their combined presence lent the day a particular weight. This was no longer the sudden but natural passing of an ailing woman. It was an investigation, and that word, once spoken, seemed to sharpen the air. Miss Marple, having finished her modest breakfast of porridge and a boiled egg, tied on her garden hat and set out, not in the direction of the Harcourt house, but by way of the High Street. She knew better than to arrive too soon. When the police are doing their rounds, the most one can gather is what they wish to tell you. But in the post office, in the bakery, and at the hedge where the Harcourt's gardener took his tea, people were apt to reveal more than they intended. She was rewarded almost immediately at the post office. Mrs. Finch, already bustling about behind the counter, lowered her voice and leaned forward. Constable says they found the letter still in Mrs. Bartlett's handbag, Miss Marple. Unopened, too. Curious, isn't it? Most people open their post at once. Perhaps she meant to read it later, Miss Marple suggested mildly, though in her mind, a letter received in the morning and not opened by late afternoon had a certain significance. Was it addressed by hand? It was, Mrs. Finch said, pursing her lips. Neat hand, a lady's, as I said before. No return address. Cream paper. From the post office, Miss Marple took a slow path past the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement was in her front garden deadheading roses. My dear, such a to-do, Mrs. Clement sighed. Beckett's had the Harcourts maiden twice already. Poor girl's frightened to death. She says Mrs. Bartlett was awake when she took up the tea tray at 1:30, but she didn't drink the tea at all. Just sat there, looking out the window. Miss Marple nodded, filing it beside Mrs. Finch's information. Awake. Tea untouched. Letter unopened. A curious list, made more curious by the scent that lingered on the pillow. She did not have to wait long for more to surface. Outside the Harcourt gate, Tom Biddle was trimming the hedge, a task he seemed to stretch out to accommodate the steady trickle of visitors. Inspector says she wasn't holding the bottle nor the glass, Tom remarked when Miss Marple greeted him. On the table they were, neat as anything. But I swear that bottle wasn't there when I swept the balcony. I'd have seen it. And the scent? Miss Marple asked, tilting her head as though considering the hydrangeas. Still there, miss. Like someone had been liberal with it. Funny thing. Mrs. Bartlett told me once she'd a nose like a bloodhound. Couldn't stand perfumes. Inside the Harcourt house, Inspector Beckett was conferring with Mrs. Harcourt in the morning room. Miss Marple, having been invited in, quietly seated herself by the window. She made no pretense of interfering, but her eyes, bright on the brim of her hat, absorbed every detail. Beckett was calm but persistent, asking about Mrs. Bartlett's health, her habits, her visitors. She had few visitors, Mrs. Harcourt said, with a faint edge. Since my sister's passing, she had grown reserved. Some might call it lonely. She valued her privacy. And no one from outside the village came to see her during her stay? Mrs. Harcourt hesitated. Not that I saw, but I was occupied much of the time with preparations for the tea. Miss Marple thought of Harriet's remark about the locked door, a woman concerned for her safety, yet inviting no visitors, unless they came unseen or unannounced. When Beckett took his leave to question the housemaid again, Miss Marple lingered, turning to Harriet, who had been listening from the far side of the room. My dear, do you remember what Mrs. Bartlett was wearing when she retired yesterday? A pale green dress, Harriet said promptly. She liked soft colors, though she often said they didn't suit her as they once did. And her little pearl brooch. No scent on her then? No, Harriet said slowly. I'd have noticed. Ah, yes, that's it. She was always particular about smells. As they spoke, the constable entered with a small object in his hand, a handkerchief, neatly folded. Found behind the bedside cabinet, ma'am, he said to Mrs. Harcourt. Might have been dropped. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. The handkerchief was white linen, edged with a fine scallop of embroidery. But what drew her attention was a faint smear at one corner. Powder, perhaps, or residue of something else entirely. Beckett took it from the constable without comment, but Miss Marple noticed how carefully he placed it into his notebook. She walked home later with her mind working gently but firmly over these small details. A letter unopened, tea untouched, a bottle that might have been moved, a scent foreign to the wearer, and now a handkerchief out of place. None of these alone proved anything, but together they formed the outline of something that did not quite match the easy explanations making the rounds in the village. By midday, speculation had settled on an obvious suspect. Mr. Russell, the vicarage lodger, was being spoken with that particular relish reserved for outsiders. He was new to the village, unmarried, and kept irregular hours. Mrs. Hartnell declared that he had been seen near the Harcourt property on the morning of the tea. Mrs. Price Ridley claimed he had a knowing look about him. Even Mr. Pritchard, normally slow to pass judgment, opined that Mr. Russell walked like a man who didn't want to be followed. Miss Marple listened to it all, without altering her knitting. She knew too well how swiftly the village could turn on someone who stood just far enough outside its familiar pattern. And she also knew that when suspicion formed too quickly, it was often because someone had quietly given a nudge in the right or wrong direction. That evening, as she sat by her window and watched the light fade over the green, Miss Marple thought again of the scent on the pillow, a scent a woman disliked. Yet it lingered around her in death. In her mind, she saw again the pillow's slight displacement, the untouched tea, the unopened letter. She could not yet see the whole picture, but she was certain of one thing. Mrs. Bartlett's end had not been the quiet, natural passing some might wish to believe. And somewhere in the village, perhaps sitting by a hearth, perhaps walking down the high street, was someone who already knew why. Chapter 4, Miss Marple quietly observes. The day settled into one of those delicate English afternoons that pretend to be peaceful while everybody's mind clatters like a scullery. Inspector Beckett made his careful rounds, and the village let him, with the air of people permitting a competent workman to see the gutters while they themselves peered upward and offered opinions about clouds. Miss Marple, who believed very much in letting a man do his work, arranged her own, which consisted chiefly of seeing things other people did not think were worth seeing. She took a jar of blackcurrant jelly to Mrs. Harcourt. "For Harriet, my dear, the shock can leave one a bit empty," and thereby found herself, after 10 consoling minutes in the morning room, alone for a moment in the guest corridor, where the air held that faint, sweet note like the echo of a music box. She did not go into the room. That would have been meddlesome, and besides, the constable had shut the door. But she looked, as women look who have spent a lifetime keeping houses from descending into muddle, and she noticed 2 small things. The first was a smudge on the white painted skirting, very near the floor, of the sort left by a shoe brushed against it while turning quickly. The second was a position of the china doorstop, a little Staffordshire spaniel, set not midway where Harriet habitually kept it. Miss Marple had been upstairs at the Harcourts often enough to know, but rather 2 inches further out, as though it had been nudged in haste, then set right by someone who had not the exact habit of the place. They were pinpricks, nothing more, yet to Miss Marple they pricked in the right direction. Downstairs, she found Harriet in the conservatory watering the ferns with far more devotion than the ferns deserved. The girl's prettiness had grown strained. Worry had sharpened it into something honest and unbeautiful. "I keep remembering the door," Harriet said, not prompted but grateful to have the thought received. "It sticks sometimes. One must lift it a fraction, then it closes properly. Did I tell Inspector Beckett that? I meant to." "You told him quite enough for a first morning," Miss Marple said, easing herself into a wicker chair. "When one is frightened, my dear, the mind makes lists and then loses them. Tell him again later, as if it were ordinary. Men listen better to ordinary things. It relaxes them." She let her eyes wander to the potting bench where a pair of gardening gloves, Harriet's, were laid palm up to dry. The right glove bore a faint brownish streak at the cuff. Too neat for earth, too dull for rust. Miss Marple said nothing, for silence is sometimes a kind of sieve, and not every mark means a stain. After tea, she made a small errand of returning, under the guise of womanly thrift, a plate that did not belong to her. It took her to Mrs. Finch, who could discuss a pie dish and the 39 articles with equal detachment. The postmistress was trimming a sheet of stamps. Inside the glass case lay 2 parcels awaiting collection. The inspector asked after yesterday morning's post again. She remarked, as if noting the weather, "He is very tidy in his questions. One could fold them." There was that letter to Mrs. Bartlett, and another odd thing, to Mr. Russell at the vicarage. No return address on that one either. People are becoming very private with their envelopes. "Privacy spreads like ivy, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple replied, admiring the neatness of the stamp edges. "Left untended, it pulls down bricks one was fond of." She did not ask to whom the letter to Mr. Russell was from. She would not be told, and the press would be to change the way people spoke to her, which mattered more than a single scrap of knowledge. But she remembered the other day's gossip. Mr. Russell had walked quickly past a Harcourt hedge, and had not looked up when his name was called. In some villages this might mean guilt. In St. Mary Mead, it also meant a kind of good sense, for nothing entangles a man faster than answering to a name in a lane. From the post office she drifted, like thistledown with purpose, to Mr. Tapp's grocer's. The bell over the door made its mild agreement to her entrance. Mr. Tapp's wife was stacking tins. Inspector Beckett has asked for any purchases of sleeping draughts, she volunteered, which, in a village, is to say she'd been asked about everything that might be a sleeping draught. We have none, of course. The chemist keeps those. But he wanted to know who bought peppermint lozenges this week. Soothing to the stomach, he says. Peppermint is a great forgiver, Miss Marple said, paying for a pat of butter and watching a child in a school cap steal a glance at the toffee jar and then deliberately look away, having been seen. She thought about chloral and peppermint, about perfumes that cover and perfumes that declare, and about the curious human habit of making a thing smell like something it is not a hope that the nose will convince the mind. At the vicarage, where she had an excuse to deliver a few sprigs of thyme from Mrs. Clement's soup, Miss Marple took the side path by the study window. The vicar was away with parish calls. A male voice within, unfamiliar, was saying, "I assure you, Inspector, I had not the slightest acquaintance with Mrs. Bartlett." Miss Marple had not intended to listen, and so she did not. But a voice carries itself whether one invites it or no. When the gate clicked behind her, the voice inside ceased, and she thought, not unkindly, how new people often forget that walls in old place are like old women, thinner than they used to be and far more attentive. She sat later in her own small parlor, the good blue cup near her hand, the knitting arranged but idle, and allowed her thoughts to unspool over ordinary objects. The scent on the pillow would have been strongest at the head of the bed and weaker at the foot. It had been strong enough that Tom Biddle noticed it from the balcony with the window open. That suggested abundance or novelty. A woman who disliked perfumes might endure a faint trace on another sleeve, but not a cloud about her own head. If the scent had been applied by Mrs. Bartlett, it argued a change of mind at the edge of her life. If by another, it argued the presence of that other very close indeed. She had once known a girl at the haberdasher's, clever with ribbons and dull with men, who had taken to wearing a fashionable scent because a handsome draper admired it. In the end, it was not the scent that betrayed her, but the excess. He liked to whisper, and she had drowned herself in it. People so often overdo the thing they are not sure of. Around 4 o'clock, Miss Marple walked to the green and sat on the bench opposite the smithy, a place where life passed by as if to be counted. School children, 2 at a time, Mrs. Price Ridley with her parasol pointed like a moral, Tom Biddle wheeling a barrow with more attention than soil, Mr. Russell alone, with a moderate haste of man pretending not to hurry. She watched faces when they passed the Harcourt gate. Some turned, some did not. Some looked down and then looked back, as though their eyes had a quarrel. Mr. Russell did not look at the house at all. He looked instead at the doctor's car, parked a few yards beyond, and the corner of his mouth tightened, not with guilt but with recognition, the way one does at a bill one has been expecting. It was very slight, and perhaps it meant that Mr. Russell disliked doctors. Many men did. In the evening, a soft rain came down, the kind that improves gardens and ruins hats. At such hours, people read the newspaper and speak to one another across rooms, as though they were across a river. Miss Marple took out her mending basket and, by lamplight, darned the heel of the stocking as she remembered a trouble from years ago in Much Benham, the case of Mr. Gorton's missing bank book, which had vanished from the pocket of his Sunday coat and made a great to-do in the lanes. There had been speeches about burglars and youths on bicycles. In the end, it was the scent of lavender that solved it. Mrs. Gorton's niece had folded the book into her aunt's petticoat drawer, intending to force a confession of some foolish lending. The drawer smelled of sachets, which Mr. Gorton could not abide. If he had opened it himself, Miss Marple remembered thinking at the time, he would have shut it again on instinct. People avoid what displeases their senses, even when their minds tell them they must press on. It is a law as regular as the post. With that thought came another, and then a small, tidy worry. Had Mrs. Bartlett been the sort to avoid the scent-soaked pillow if she disliked perfume? If the scent was on the pillow, as Tom had said, and as Miss Marple had smelled, then Mrs. Bartlett must either have lain down in spite of it, or else the scent had come to the pillow after her head. The first possibility required fear or great fatigue. The second required another person's hand. Either way, The pillow was more interesting than any bottle on a bedside table. The following morning promised to bring with it a refinement of theories. Already the village had divided into those who favored a natural passing helped along by a foolish draft, those who preferred the romance of a stranger at the gate, and those who, having heard of an unopened letter, invested heavily in drama by post. Inspector Beckett, it was said, would interview Mr. Russell properly, and the chemist had been asked to look closely at his prescriptions. The air was filling, as it always did, with the sediment of intentions, good and bad. Miss Marple pinned a note to her shopping bag, a list of sensible items, eggs, soap, a new skein of white wool, and underneath, in her neat, unassuming hand, 3 words that would remind her what questions to encourage the day to answer. Door, scent, handkerchief. She had decided that the handkerchief did not belong to Mrs. Bartlett, not only because it bore no monogram, Mrs. Harcourt's linens all did, but because the embroidery at the edge was of a pattern popular 5 years ago with a certain London house, and Mrs. Bartlett had not been to London in 6. One learns such things, not because one is clever, but because one's niece once bought the same and complained it yellowed prematurely. She blew out her lamp, set her knitting tidy, and allowed herself one last, small connection to fall into place, not as a conclusion, but as a thread leading onward. People who dislike perfumes also tend to dislike other people's handkerchiefs. It is not a rule, but it is a feeling, and feelings in small villages are often more dependable than rules. Tomorrow, she told herself, the police would make their first proper choice of suspect. Tidy, plausible, almost satisfying. She hoped they would, for nothing is so helpful to the truth as an easy theory embraced a day too soon. Chapter 5. First suspects. The police think it's simple. By the following morning, the mist had lifted, replaced by a brisk, bright light that made the green seem almost too innocent. It was the sort of morning that ought to have encouraged contentment, yet St. Mary Mead was taught with a different energy. At the post office, in the grocer's, along the lanes, people spoke in voices pitched to travel no further than a few feet, and, of course, to be overheard. Inspector Beckett had decided, with a certain quiet finality, that Mr. Russell the vicarage was the most likely person to answer the village's unspoken demand for a culprit. He did not yet say so in so many words, but the signs were plain to anyone watching. The constable was sent to the vicarage twice before noon. Mr. Russell's movements were noted with the same precision one might use in recording the times of train, and most tellingly, the inspector carried with him the air of a man whose thoughts had narrowed into a manageable shape. Miss Marple had seen that shape before. It was the shape of a conclusion drawn too soon, neat enough to satisfy, sturdy enough to defend, but liable to crumble under the weight of something small and inconvenient. She was not displeased. Such certainties, in her experience, left room for the truth to step quietly in later. The case against Mr. Russell, as the inspector understood it, was simple. He was an outsider, without the protective web of village loyalties. He had been seen near the Harcourt hedge on the morning of the tea. He received an anonymous letter on the same day Mrs. Bartlett received hers. And, most damningly in the eyes of the village, he lived alone. In St. Mary Mead, this last fact was rarely forgiven unless one was a widower, and even then only if one's wife had been remembered fondly. Late in the morning, Beckett called at Miss Marple's cottage. Not, as he said with a faint smile, for advice, but for context. Over tea, he was not a man to refuse a good cup. He laid out his view. Russell admits to walking past the Harcourt's place that morning, Beckett said, stirring his cup absently. Claims he was on his way to see the vicar, found him not at home, and turned back. Harcourt's maid says she saw a man at the front gate just before luncheon, but couldn't swear to it being him. We'll have a word with the vicar about his lodger's comings and goings. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes demurely fixed on the teapot. I'm sure you will, Inspector. It is always good to be thorough. Beckett smiled faintly. We've also learned that Mrs. Bartlett was seen in conversation with Mr. Russell last week, outside the post office. Short exchange, but the sort of thing one remembers when he let the sentence trail off. When something happens at one of the parties, Miss Marple finished gently. Yes, people do remember such things then, and sometimes they remember more than occurred at the time. He gave her a look that suggested he had not entirely dismissed a warning, though he was too polite to admit it. We'll take a statement from him today. If there's more to his acquaintance with Mrs. Bartlett, I mean to find it. After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat for a moment, her tea cooling beside her, and thought about that supposed conversation outside the post office. She had seen it herself. In fact, though it had not seemed remarkable at the time, Mrs. Bartlett had been carrying a parcel, Mr. Russell a newspaper, and their words had been brief, their faces perfectly ordinary. The only thing Miss Marple recalled distinctly was that Mrs. Bartlett had looked over her shoulder before stepping away. Such a movement could mean nothing, or it could mean that she had expected someone else to appear. By midday, the village was treating Mr. Russell's guilt as a polite inevitability. Mrs. Hartnell claimed to have never liked his eyes, while Mrs. Price really opined that he had the look of a man who could do with a firm hand. At the grocer's, Mr. Tapper remarked that Russell bought sardines and olive oil, which tells you a lot about a man. If you ask me, no one did ask him, but he offered it all the same. Miss Marple listened without discouraging them. It would not do to challenge the tide yet. People who believe themselves in the current of truth rarely take kindly to being told they are paddling in circles. Instead, she busied herself with her errands, stopping at the chemist for a small box of aspirin and, incidentally, asking after the popularity of certain prescriptions. Mr. Lane, the chemist, was precise in all things, especially his record-keeping. Chloral hydrate? Only 2 prescriptions in the last fortnight. Mrs. Bartlett's, of course, and one for Mr. Carver in much Benham. The draft I gave her was a standard strength, nothing unusual. She collected it herself on Tuesday. She did not send anyone in her place. No, Miss Marple, herself. And she paid in cash, as she always did. Wouldn't put things on account. Said it muddled the mind. Miss Marple thanked him and left, reflecting on the fact that Mrs. Bartlett, so careful in her habits, had not touched her tea on the day she died, nor, apparently, her sleeping draught. The neatness of the untouched glass and bottles still troubled her, not the neatness itself, but the sense that it had been arranged to appear so. In the afternoon, she walked past the vicarage just as Mr. Russell emerged, accompanied by the inspector. The younger man's face was pale, but not with guilt, Miss Marple thought. It was the pallor of one who has been examined for faults he does not yet understand. He paused when he saw her. Miss Marple, he said, managing a strained smile. It seems I am suddenly a person of interest. Only in the police sense, Mr. Russell, she replied pleasantly. In the village sense, you have been a person of interest for some time. He gave a short laugh, more grateful than amused, and went on his way. The inspector watched him go, his expression unreadable. That evening, the village had settled into the first stage of satisfaction that follows a working theory. Even those who prided themselves on keeping an open mind were clearly enjoying the orderliness of having a likely culprit. Miss Marple sat by her fire, the glow touching her knitting, and thought about the way suspicion had moved so quickly to Mr. Russell. It had not crept there, it had leapt as if guided, and she wondered, though she would not yet say it aloud, who in St. Mary Mead might have been quietly nudging it along. Chapter 6. A hidden clue, overlooked but vital. Inspector Beckett's quiet industry continued into a second morning, the sort of steady, capable movement which reassures a village that something official is being done. Men like Beckett, Miss Marple thought, were the best kind of policemen to have when people were inclined to embroider. His manner discouraged flourishes. He went to and fro between the Harcourt house and the vicarage, returning, like a conscientious bee, with small pellets of fact. The facts: Mr. Russell's walk past the hedge, the anonymous letters, the sleeping draft, were arranged, in his notebook at least, into something that looked remarkably like a case. Miss Marple, who preferred knitting to notebooks for her arrangements, had begun to feel the smallest itch at the back of her mind, a sign, in her experience, that something tiny had been put down in the wrong drawer. The itch did not concern Mr. Russell, though she watched him as one watches a person whom others are determined to watch. It concerned the room where Mrs. Bartlett had died, and a scent which did not suit its occupant. She had a domestic excuse to return. Harriet had sent a note, apologetic and young, asking if Miss Marple might advise on airs and linens, As the house felt suddenly stale, and neither she nor the maid could agree what should be taken down to air. It was a request any older woman in St. Mary Mead might have received in such a week. Miss Marple put on her hat and went. She found Harry in the passage outside the airing cupboard, teetering between resolve and bewilderment with an armful of pillowcases. "We always change the summer things in May," she said, a crease between her brows. "But Aunt's old lists are so complicated one hardly dares deviate. There are best, second best, and company best, and then a note for moths, cedar, which I never quite understood." Miss Marple opened the cupboard doors. The sweet, clean breath of sun-dried linen rose to meet them, with something else beneath it, faint but not imaginary, like a memory tucked into a stack of napkins. She ran a gentle hand along the front edges of the piles, not disturbing more than a thread. The Harcourt household, like all well-run houses, labeled its shelves with discreet penciled words on the inner frame. Guest pillowcases, summer. Guest pillowcases, winter. And so on. The summer pile had been dipped into recently. The winter pile, in theory, should have been untouched since March, yet its edge was not quite square. A corner, only a corner, sat a quarter-inch forward, the minute disobedience of something taken and replaced by an unfamiliar hand. "May I?" Miss Marple asked, and when Harriet nodded she lifted the top winter case free. Upon the shelf beneath was a dusting no sensible maid would have left. Not common dust nor the fluff of linen, but a pale, fine powder that clung to the wood and to the tip of Miss Marple's gloved finger. She rubbed it thoughtfully. It had a silken feel and the ghost of scent at once old-fashioned and a little shop-girl gay. Orris, perhaps, or violet talc, the sort of powder sold in boxes with cheerful paper and guiltless frills. "We've never used powders among the linen," Harriet said, startled. Aunt thought it messy. "Only lavender bags for drawers." "Lavender is an excellent fellow," Miss Marple murmured. "It does its work and makes no fuss. Powder does its work and tells everyone." She set the winter case back and shut the cupboard, thinking how a winter pillowcase carries with it, if one is not careful, the scent of how one keeps it safe from moths. Some houses trust cedar, others, Orris lays talc in little sachets. Either way, one does not lay a winter case on a pillow in June without bringing its season with it. In the guest corridor, the constable had left the door to the room just ajar. He was fetching the inspector, he said, and did not mind if Miss Marple fetched Miss Harriet's book from the little table. "Only the book, ma'am, if you please." Miss Marple complied, her step as unobtrusive as a cat. The room felt cooler now, the air changed by the coming and going of men in sensible shoes. Yet the echo of that oversweet note lingered, thinned out but persistent. At the head of the bed, beneath the curve of the brass rail, a darker line showed between carpet and skirting. Nothing more, to the casual eye, than a shadow cast by the way the light fell. To Miss Marple's eye was a faint crescent of the same powder she had touched on the shelf, pressed into the nap where a knee might have found purchase, or a hand, reaching and steadying as one bent over a pillow. She did not kneel. There was no need to make a spectacle of housekeeping in a police room. But as she turned, the little Staffordshire Spaniel doorstop smiled its glossy, innocent smile at her, still 2 inches out from where Harriet habitually kept it. She looked to the skirting again and saw, not far from the powder crescent, the tiniest paper flake, violet-tinted, like the scrap of a sachet that had been torn and handled with fingers a trifle damp. She fetched the book, thanked the constable, and said nothing at all. Downstairs, in the morning room, Mrs. Harcourt was speaking to Inspector Beckett with the stately patience of a woman determined not to be made ridiculous in her own house. Miss Marple, returning the book to Harriet, let her gaze rest for a moment on the company. The maid, Edna, stood by the sideboard, taut with the importance of not fidgeting. Cook had appeared on the pretext of inquiring about luncheon. Dr. Haydock had been waylaid and sat, annoyed with himself for staying, on an upright chair. Beckett, neat as ever, made notes. "It is the oddest thing," Miss Marple said mildly, folding her hands so the knitting mind might have the mouse assistance. "How clever of you, Mrs. Harcourt, to bring cedar and powder into use so early in the summer. One would have thought the moths hardly begun." "Cedar?" Mrs. Harcourt repeated, distracted. "We use lavender, Miss Marple. I have never endured powders." They get into lace. Of course, Miss Marple returned, as if pleasantly corrected. Lavender's a thing for drawers. Only there was the faintest breath of orris in the cupboard. Perhaps one of the winter pillowcases had a sachet for protection? I dare say it is nothing. Old habits of mind. One notices drawers as one notices weather. She smiled, foolish and useful, and watched faces as one watches a village pond. The first ripple shows where the fish lie. Mrs. Harcourt looked puzzled, as she would, being honest. Dr. Haydock looked bored, and then, being cleverer than he liked to admit, thoughtful. Harriet glanced at the maid, and the maid, poor Edna, blushed to the hairline and bit her lip, as a girl does when something she has done, for good or ill, has the misfortune to resemble a fault. We never, Edna began, and stopped herself, eyes flicking to her mistress. Beckett, who Miss Leslie allowed, wrote a word, drew a small box around it, and tucked the word away. Tom Biddle told me something odd. Cook put in brisk in her relief at a contribution that did not involve her kitchen, asking if anyone wanted the bedroom fire laid last night. In June, he said someone spoke to him about ashes from the guest room grate, as if there were any. Not in my house. I told him, we don't make stuff for moths to eat. She snorted. Ashes indeed. Who asked him? Beckett said, turning. Cook hesitated, caught between affection and propriety. He wouldn't say, but he said it was a lady voice, trying not to be, if you take me, put on a kind of boldness to hide the asking. She looked apologetically at Harriet, who stiffened and then softened at once, sensing the village's mercy closing in around her like a shawl. Ashes, Miss Marple repeated softly, as if tasting a doubtful recipe. Ashes are very thorough. They swallow what is given to them and tell no tales. Except, of course, when it is June and there is no fire. Beckett rose. I should like to see that cupboard, he said. Mrs. Harcourt, if you please. He was careful with his tone. A well-run house could be as proud as a regiment, and it did not serve to sound as if one doubted its drills. They went, and Miss Marple, who had no business to follow, did not. She sat with Harry a moment and patted the girl's hand. We old people fuss about drawers, she said, cheerful as a kettle. You must forgive us. When the world seems untidy, one likes to set the linen straight. Harriet looked at her with gratitude, so sudden it showed the rawness beneath. I thought we had done something wrong, she confessed in a whisper. Edna and I, we took the winter cases out 2 nights ago. It felt silly, but Mrs. Bartlett said she was cold, and Mama was busy with the tea, and the summer ones were in the wash. The winter ones smell, oh, you noticed, like those powdery boxes Aunt used to scold. I ought to have. You ought to have kept your guests warm, Miss Marple said, and there was no censure in it. Which you did. Tell the inspector, so when he asks, tell him just so. Men like a reason that does not hide behind a better one. When Beckett returned, he had the look of a man with a new small fact under his hat. There's powder on the winter shelf, he said, not to Miss Marple, but in a general way that included her without acknowledging it, and a sachet paper scrap by the guest bed. We shall ask the maid about changes of linen. He turned pages back in his notebook. Dr. Haydock, you said our sleeping draught smelled plainly of chloral, the usual sweetness. No orris there, so our scent is separate. Quite, said Dr. Haydock, with the air of a man who had been rescued from a boring tea party. Your killer, inspector, if you must have a dramatic phrase at breakfast, is a person with a tidy mind, masks one smell with another, chooses a season's linen for a purpose, and remembers to set a bottle and glass just so. That excludes most men in the village. It excludes some women, too, Miss Marple added placidly. The ones who would simply throw a shawl over the whole business and call it done. Beckett almost smiled. I take the point. He shut the notebook. Miss Marple, you remarked yesterday that something that should have been present was not. Have you decided what? Miss Marple considered him kindly. Only that Mrs. Bartlett, who disliked scents, would not have laid her head on a pillow that declared itself so boldly, unless she was too tired to heed it, or the scent came after her head did. Both are informative in different ways. She rose, a small, unthreatening figure, and smoothed her skirt. I think, Inspector, that the thing nobody minds, the household habit, will tell you more than any letter. He nodded, half skeptical, wholly attentive. As she left, the hallway offered its usual village gifts. A chance meeting with Tom Biddle, his cap in his hands, saying in a low voice that someone had been in the garden after dusk. He'd seen the trace on the damp earth by the conservatory step. A heel turned quick, not Harriet's, who walks with her toes like a dancer. And a glimpse, through the glass of the front door, of Mr. Russell striding by on the far pavement, jaw set, eyes forward, like a man resolved to let other people finish their arguments without him. Back at home, Miss Marple set her blue cup down and, before the tea was poured, wrote 3 more words under yesterday's list. Winter shelf. Ashes. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added a 4th. Knees. One does not press a pillow without the body telling a few truths to the carpet. Powder and pressure are terrible liars. The clue sat there, quiet and domestic, as household things do when they are waiting to become important. No one, say the person who had brought powder into summer and bent over a pillow in a room that was not hers, would have thought it mattered. But that person, somewhere in the village, hands busy with an ordinary task, had already felt the twitch that comes when a small object one had counted on to be invisible begins, in spite of one's tidying, to be seen. Chapter 7. Confrontations and Secrets. The powder and pillow had changed the air of the investigation, though Inspector Beckett did not yet say so aloud. It was clear enough in the way he moved through the village that afternoon, slower, more deliberate, as if measuring the width of every doorway he passed. St. Mary Mead, sensitive to such changes in official gait, felt the shift as well. By tea-time, the easy satisfaction of blaming Mr. Russell had begun to fray, replaced by something sharper and more personal. The faint awareness that anyone, even one's next-door neighbor, might be hiding something. Miss Marple had seen it all before. Scandal, she knew, was rarely a matter of single crime. It was a net that, once cast, drew up all manner of small, wriggling secrets that had nothing to do with the original catch. The Bartlett business was no exception. By the time she walked to the green the next morning, she had already overheard 3 conversations which had begun in sympathy for Mrs. Harcourt and ended in the quiet unpicking of someone else's past. The first was in the grocer's, where Mrs. Price Ridley confided to Mrs. Hartnell, loud enough for Miss Marple to hear while examining the marmalade, that Harriet had been seen walking with a young bank clerk on Thursday evenings. In London that might mean nothing, Mrs. Price Ridley declared. But here, one can't help wondering. In the post office, Mrs. Finch leaned over the counter to murmur that Edna, the Harcourt's maid, had once been dismissed from a place in much Benham, under circumstances best left unspoken. Mrs. Finch, of course, had no intention of leaving them unspoken, and in the lane behind the vicarage, Miss Marple came upon Tom Biddle, in heated conversation with cook. I told her plain, Tom was saying, no one's to be in that garden after 8:30. She looked me in the eye and said she'd been nowhere near, but there was her shoe mark, same as on the step. Cook noticed Miss Marple then, and her voice flattened into respectability. Morning, Miss Marple. Lovely day for the washing. It was not only servants and younger people who felt the tension. That afternoon, Miss Marple found herself invited to tea at Mrs. Harcourt's, ostensibly to advise on arrangements for the memorial service. The drawing-room felt cooler than usual, though the windows were shut. Harriet poured tea with careful precision, her hands betraying a faint tremor. Mrs. Harcourt, upright in her armchair, began with polite inquiries about Miss Marple's roses before leaning forward slightly. Miss Marple, she said, in the tone of one who has rehearsed a question, do you believe the inspector suspects someone in my household? Miss Marple regarded her hostess kindly. The inspector, she said, is far too discreet to speak of his suspicions. But I've often found that when people live under the same roof, they sometimes see each other's actions without quite seeing the reason for them. That can look, to a stranger, like concealment. Harriet's cup rattled faintly in its saucer. You mean, she said, that something innocent might look otherwise? Precisely, my dear. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to settle lightly on Harriet's face. And sometimes, too, something that appears innocent is in fact a careful performance. One mustn't confuse the two. The effect of this was immediate. Harriet's eyes dropped, her lips pressing together as though to hold back a defense that might not be wise. Mrs. Harcourt, whose natural instinct was to control her surroundings, intervened briskly. "We have nothing to hide, Miss Marple, but I will admit, it unsettles me to have my maid question about bed linen as though it were a matter of treason." "It is not the linen itself," Miss Marple said gently. "It is the choice of it. Choices, you see, are often more telling than people imagine, especially when they are made in a hurry." The remark hung in the air for a moment before Mrs. Harcourt changed the subject with a firmness that told Miss Marple she had said enough for now. Leaving the Harcourt house, Miss Marple took the path that led past the vicarage garden. She found Mr. Russell leaning on the low brick wall, smoking a cigarette with the abstracted air of someone who knows he is watched and is determined not to appear furtive. He greeted her politely. "I understand," he said, "that I am now something less than respectable in the eyes of the village." "In the eyes of some," Miss Marple allowed. "But people's views are rarely fixed. They shift according to what they hear next." He gave a short, rueful laugh. "Then I hope the next thing they hear is in my favor. The inspector tells me Mrs. Bartlett had a letter on the day she died. He seemed to think I might know something about it. And do you?" "No." He dropped his cigarette into the gravel and ground it out with his heel. "I spoke to her once outside the post office. She asked me if I had been to London recently. When I said I hadn't, she laughed. Oddly, I thought, and walked away. That's all." Miss Marple stored this away without comment. An odd laugh at an unexpected answer was worth remembering. By the time she reached her cottage, the afternoon light had begun to fade, and she was met at her gate by Edna, the Harcourt's maid. The girl looked pale and agitated. "I didn't do anything wrong, Miss Marple," she said quickly, as though the words had been waiting at her lips for hours. "About the pillowcases, I only did what Miss Harriet told me, but I didn't put that powder there. I swear it." Miss Marple laid a reassuring hand on the girl's arm. "I'm sure you did what you thought best. Sometimes, my dear, a person leaves behind something without meaning to, and it tells a story they'd rather not have told. That's all the inspector is trying to find out." Edna hesitated. "There's something else. The night before the tea, I went up to turn down the bed, and the window was open. There was someone in the garden, just a shadow by the hedge. I thought it was Tom, but when I called, they moved away without a word. I didn't tell the inspector. I didn't want to get anyone in trouble." "You've told me now," Miss Marple said softly. "And sometimes, Edna, that's the first step toward making sure the right person is in trouble and no one else." That night, sitting by her fire, Miss Marple thought about the powder on the winter linen, the shadow by the hedge, and the small, seemingly disconnected confessions that were beginning to surface. The inspector's gaze might still be fixed on Mr. Russell, but the village was starting to turn its attention inward, and Miss Marple, who knew better than most how quickly fear could make neighbors into enemies, felt certain that before long, someone in St. Mary Mead would say too much, and in saying it, reveal exactly what they had hoped to hide. Chapter 8. Another twist, a second crime. The following morning broke with an unsettled brightness, the kind of light that feels too thin to last, and indeed it did not. Before the clock in Miss Marple's sitting room had struck 9, the first knock came, a brisk, hurried tapping that told her more than the caller's voice would. When she opened the door, Harriet Harcourt stood there, pale and tight-lipped. "Miss Marple, I'm so sorry to bother you. Mama thought you should know at once. Something's happened." It took only a few sentences, spoken on the garden path, to understand the essentials. Mrs. Harcourt's locked writing desk had been forced during the night, a small locked compartment within rifled, and a will, Mrs. Bartlett's, had gone missing. Harriet spoke quickly, almost as if she hoped to outrun the implications. "We hadn't even told anyone it was there, but she'd left it with Mama for safekeeping, saying she'd have use of it soon. And now gone." Miss Marple asked only one question. "Was anything else taken?" "Nothing. The jewelry is all in its place. The desk silver paper knife is gone, but that might have been used to pry open the lock." They walked together to the Harcourt house, the village already stirring with the knowledge that something had occurred. Inspector Beckett was there ahead of them, standing by the writing desk with his notebook open, the constable nearby. clearly pleased at the prospect of a tangible crime. The desk's top drawer bore the neat but visible scar of having been forced, its lock bent. "It happened sometime between 10 last night and 7 this morning," Beckett said, glancing up as Miss Marple entered. No sign of forced entry to the house. Either the thief had a key or was already inside. Miss Marple's gaze moved gently over the room, the heavy curtains still drawn, the faint odor of extinguished lamp oil, the small rug near the desk, slightly askew as though it had been nudged by a careless foot. "And the paper knife?" she asked. "Missing," Beckett confirmed. "Silver handle, ivory blade. Not much use except as a lever. Harriet had gone to fetch her mother, and in her absence, Edna hovered by the door, wringing her hands. "It's my fault, I expect," she blurted. "I was the last to lock up. I didn't try the windows in here, only the ones in the dining room. This 1 inch," she gestured to the French doors, "sticks in the frame, so I thought it safe." Beckett made a note, but did not chide her. Miss Marple, however, noticed something in Edna's tone, a defensive quickness, as though she feared a particular suspicion more than the general fact of neglect. Mrs. Harcourt entered, composed but clearly shaken. "Inspector, this is beyond endurance. First poor Mrs. Bartlett's death, now this. I cannot help thinking the two must be connected. Why else would anyone want her will?" "That," Beckett said, "is precisely the question. The news, of course, spread faster than any official inquiry. By the time Miss Marple left the Harcourt house, the village green was already hosting clusters of speculation. Mr. Pritchard, the ironmonger, announced that wills were often changed at the last moment, while Mrs. Price really countered that a stolen will meant someone had been cut out of it. Mrs. Hartnell, never one to let fact interfere with theory, declared that Mr. Russell's name was bound to be in there somewhere. Miss Marple, moving through these eddies of opinion, found herself less interested in the will's disappearance than in the way people reacted to it. Harriet, for all her agitation, had been careful to mention that no jewelry had been taken. Edna had volunteered her possible guilt before being asked. Mrs. Harcourt had gone directly to the idea that the two events, death and theft, were linked, and Beckett, for all his measured tone, had looked almost satisfied to have something tangible to investigate. That afternoon, she went to the vicarage under the pretext of delivering a jar of quince jelly to Mrs. Clement. Mr. Russell, emerging from the study, looked worn and faintly irritated. "So," he said, "now I am suspected of burglary as well as murder?" Miss Marple's tone was mild. "I do not think the inspector suspects you of either, Mr. Russell, but I do think someone may be very happy for the village to suspect you of both." He frowned. "Why?" "Because suspicion, like cream, rises to the top and hides what is underneath." Her next call was to Dr. Haydock, who had been at the Harcourts earlier. He was standing in his surgery doorway, looking as if the world had presented him with one puzzle too many. "If you ask me," he said, "this whole business is just another way of stirring the pot. Bartlett was a cautious woman. If she wanted something known, she'd have told it to the right ears before putting it on paper. The paper may be gone, but the knowledge will be somewhere." Miss Marple walked home with the doctor's words in mind. Somewhere, in her own experience, knowledge in a village was never entirely confined to paper. It had a way of leaking into remarks, into half-finished sentences, into the glances exchanged over teacups. And if Mrs. Bartlett had hinted to anyone about the will's contents, that person might now feel either emboldened or very much at risk. It was almost evening when another small detail arrived, as such things often did, by accident. Tom Biddle was mending the fence near the green when she passed, and he remarked, without quite meeting her eye, that he'd seen light in the Harcourt's morning room after midnight. "Just a slip between the curtains," he said. "Could have been the street lamp showing through, but the angle was queer, and then it went out sudden-like." Miss Marple paused on the path. "You didn't mention it to the inspector?" Tom shook his head. Didn't seem worth fussing over. Thought maybe Harriet was reading late. Harriet, Miss Marple thought, who had been so precise about nothing else being stolen. Harriet, who poured tea with shaking hands and kept glancing at her mother for cues. And yet too easy, far too easy. In her experience, the obvious watcher was rarely the thief, The true culprit kept their hands politely folded while others drew attention to themselves. By nightfall, the village was humming with the notion that the missing would prove the key to the whole affair. Miss Marple, sitting by her fire with her knitting, allowed herself a faint smile. A will might change fortunes, but it was a reason for the change that interested her. Somewhere, in the dusting of powder on a winter pillowcase, in the shadow by the hedge, in the scent that had no place in Mrs. Bartlett's room, lay the thread that tied both crimes together. And when that thread was pulled, gently, firmly, it would not be Mr. Russell's name that came loose, but another's entirely. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The web of lies deepens. By the next day, the village had developed a practiced way of discussing both the death and the missing will in the same breath, as if they had always belonged together. It was a habit St. Mary Mead had, of plaiting two separate strands, until even those who knew better could not easily unpick them. Inspector Beckett, while he did not endorse the plait, no longer tried to comb it out in public. He had begun, Miss Marple noted, to ask questions that were smaller and closer to the bone. Miss Marple, who was always civil to the truth and to wool merchants, took the 10 o'clock bus to Much Benham. She had a list for Mr. Bell's stationers, cards for her niece, a new blotter, and, though she would not say so aloud, curiosity. Gossip travels by foot in a village. By the time it reaches the next town, it has found respectable lodging. Shops, especially, develop a talent for receiving it. Mr. Bell was trimming a sheet of nibs with his long, ink-stained fingers when the bell tinkled. Miss Marple, your usual envelopes? And the blue refills for the waterman, I think. He had the pleased air of a man who keeps other people's little preferences filed in a tidy drawer of his mind. If you please, Miss Marple said, smiling. And perhaps, oh, that cream writing pack you keep under glass? The one with the decent rag content. My niece says it takes ink without sulking. Mr. Bell produced it with ceremony. Mayfair cream. Very popular this month. We had a quantity in last week. Perfumed. Lightly, mind you. The supplier thinks ladies like such frippery. Orris or some such. Miss Marple's finger rested a moment on the violet-tinted tissue that wrapped it. Violet like the tiny paper flake on the Harcourt's carpet. So many fripperies, she agreed. I suppose you could tell me who else shares my niece's taste? I should like to avoid duplicating a gift for the same lady. One doesn't wish to make a woman smell like her neighbor. Mr. Bell beamed at the sensible practicality. Quite right. Let me think. Mrs. Price Ridley took a pack on Monday. Said her goddaughter had come over from Tunbridge Wells and must be encouraged to write properly. Mrs. Clement ordered one but didn't collect. And, yes, Miss Harriet Harcourt purchased one a fortnight ago. Said she wanted better paper for acknowledgments. He hesitated, then added, and Dr. Haydock bought two last week. Present for patients, he said. The good man prefers a practical gift. Very practical, Miss Marple murmured. Thank you, Mr. Bell. Oh, and a small book of violet stamps. They make such a tidy line. Outside, she stood a moment with her parcels beneath the awning and let the light collect itself around the thought. The pack was perfumed. Its tissue was violet. A violet scrap had been by the bed. A scent had hovered where it ought not. Mrs. Bartlett's letter had come on cream paper in a lady's hand. Mr. Russell's letter likewise. Both might have been written by anyone in the village who had bought a pack. Harriet, Mrs. Price Ridley, Dr. Haydock's recipients, or someone borrowing with or without permission. Cream paper and perfume did what gossip did. It blurred edges, carried resemblance, made different hands seem cousins. On her way to the bus, she stepped into Sedgwick and Fortnum, solicitors, under the excuse of asking about a small parish charity that sometimes benefited from bequests. Mr. Sedgwick, who had the comfortable look of a man padded with other people's caution, came out himself. We are not at liberty to discuss clients, Miss Marple, he said with the air of one who has repeated the phrase often and enjoys it. Of course not, Miss Marple agreed amiably, and I would not wish you to. I only wondered, and here she adopted the confiding tone of a woman circumventing her own forgetfulness, whether, in your experience, people who lodge wills with friends, well, with the Mrs. Harcourt of this world, tend at the same time to lodge a copy with their solicitor. One hears of so many copies lying about. That is certainly the sensible practice, Mr. Sedgwick conceded, the enjoyment dimming into courtesy. As a general principle, I will deposit it here remains here unless withdrawn. Just so, Miss Marple said, as if she had merely been testing her memory, and as she made her polite retreat, she thought, if a copy existed in Much Benham, then the theft at the Harcourts was more urgency than strategy. A hurried hand scrabbling for paper believed could hurt. The bus hissed back into St. Mary Mead shortly before noon. Inspector Beckett, crossing the green with the purposeful loaf of a man sent for bread, and bringing back intelligence, altered his course to meet her. Miss Marple, a word? We found the paper knife, the silver one, from the Harcourt's desk, in the shrubbery by the lane behind their fence. White, but not thoroughly. A smear of something that isn't earth. Orris, she asked, as if checking her shopping. Could be. Beckett had learned not to look surprised when she stepped ahead of him. And a thread, fine, pale green. Could be from a dress or sleeve. Pale green, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Harriet's remark had come back to her. The pale green dress Mrs. Bartlett had worn when she retired. Many young ladies have pale green frocks this summer, she said. It is flattering to girls and cruel to women. Beckett glanced sideways, half smiling. We'll ask our ladies anyway. They stood a moment by the bench looking across to the Harcourt gate, where Tom Biddle was speaking to Edna, in the strained, sideways fashion of two people who have suddenly discovered the world is listening. Tom, Miss Marple called, with her usual matter-of-fact cheer. You once did month at Mr. Sprott's, the upholsterer in Much Benham, did you not? Tom turned, surprise into honesty. I did, miss. Springtime repairing chairs. Didn't Mr. Sprott sell sachets to put among the winter things? Violet boxes, all frills. Aye, Tom said, rubbing the back of his neck. Sold them by the dozen. Ladies liked M. He'd say orris and such kept out moths where cedar failed. He blinked, then added, almost apologetically, Mrs. Price Ridley were fond of them. Indeed she was, Edna put in, with the quickness of a girl who has dusted such drawers. Her house smelt like a dress shop at Christmas. The merest twitch touched Beckett's pencil. He did not write it down, which was, in Miss Marple's experience, a way of writing it down twice. After luncheon, Miss Marple went calling. Nothing improper, simply the small revolutions an elderly lady makes through her own world. At the vicarage, she found Mrs. Clement folding parish circulars. We never collected the writing pack, the vicar's wife confessed, laughing at herself. I forgot my purse and then forgot the errand. Mrs. Price Ridley urged me to take hers. She bought one too many, she said, so polite and pressing that I nearly did. But I had a sandwich in one hand, and Providence in the other, and declined. She paused, frowning delicately. It is a trifle odd when one thinks of it. Mrs. Price Ridley is generous only when she is being something else. Steering, Miss Marple suggested with her small, kind malice. She likes the satisfaction of knowing which lane a thing will take. From there to Dr. Haydock's for a chatter about chilblains, the doctor's joke, for it was June, and a serious question about whether Mrs. Bartlett's bottle might have been moved after death. It might, he said, candid and brisk, by a tidy murderer or an untidy maid. But the pillow had the look of having been weighted, then smoothed. A hand heavy here, light there, the sort of touch you see in nurses who have changed sheets beneath a patient without waking her. Household competence, you know, not clumsiness. Not a man's hand, Miss Marple said mildly. Not many men's, he allowed. I could name two in the village who could do it, and only one who would recognize a need. When she returned home, a scrap of thought fluttered down and settled where she could read it. The writing packs, the perfume, the violet tissue, Mrs. Price Ridley's attempt to press a pack upon Mrs. Clement, Harriet's own purchase, Dr. Haydock's gifts. A woman's hand might write two letters and leave two people puzzled, one dead, one accused. A woman's habit might bring winter powder into summer, and then try to sweep away the trace with a pale green sleeve. A woman's tidiness might set the bottle and glass just so. Yet Miss Marple did not believe in villains made of only one woman. Villainy was a social event more often than not. Someone for the bold step, someone for the quiet word, someone for the helpful suggestion that set suspicion in a particular lane. She had seen it in church committees and in crimes. Near 6 o'clock, as the evening deepened into that melancholy clarity June sometimes has, there was a small commotion by the pond. Mr. Pritchard, the ironmonger, had produced, with a flourish, an object from his bicycle bag, a torn envelope of Mayfair cream, addressed to H.R. In a neat feminine hand, found, he announced, in the hedge by the Harcourt's lane. H.R. could be anyone, he proclaimed. But if you ask me, no one asked you, Mrs. Hartnell said tartly, which was as close as she came to gratitude. H.R. Miss Marple remarked to no one in particular, might be Harriet. It might also be Mrs. Price Ridley, if one is careless about initials. Or Mr. Russell, if the lady addressing found him tiresome, and used only his first. Beckett took the scrap without ceremony. We'll compare the hand, he said. If we can find anything to compare it to. You can, Miss Marple said. To the address on Mrs. Bartlett's parcel last week. Mrs. Finch remembers everything she does and half of what others do. And then, because it is best to lay the next breadcrumb where the ducks can see it, she added. And to the label on the sachet boxes at Mr. Sprott's in Much Benham. Some ladies keep the outer slips as bookmarks. They show a hand you'd recognize anywhere in a village. When she was alone again, she wrote on her kitchen list beneath eggs and soap a neat inventory of what the day had given her. Mayfair cream, Byers, violet tissue, orris and linen, knife and hedge, pale green thread, envelope to H.R. Then, after a moment's pause, she added two names side by side, not because she had chosen between them, but because the web between them had begun to show. Harriet Price Ridley. Two very different women, one agreeable, one managing. And yet threads ran between them. Writing paper, a press gift, a will lodge for safekeeping. A girl encouraged, perhaps, to sign something she did not read. And behind that, another pair quite as unlike. The maid with her anxious honesty and the doctor with his dry charity, both standing closer to the heart of the house than the village liked to admit. It was not the answer. Miss Marple did not pretend to that, but it was a map of scent and stationery and small pushes, and she thought, as the kill began its business, that the killer had relied on two old truths, that women's choices are dismissed as fripperies, and that, when what goes missing, people will talk themselves blind about money. In the talking, the little things would go on being little, unless one loved little things as much as Miss Marple did. Chapter 10. The reveal, the real killer exposed. The inspector had suggested, with the kind of mild reluctance Miss Marple always found promising, that everyone connected with Mrs. Bartlett should meet in the Harcourt's drawing room that afternoon. Officially, it was to clarify timelines. Unofficially, it was a moment when lines of suspicion would either tighten around one person's neck or fray entirely. The gathering was small but taut. Mrs. Harcourt sat in her usual chair, her hands folded with deliberate calm. Harriet occupied the seat beside her, looking paler than her summer frock allowed. Mr. Russell stood near the mantel, pretending not to notice that Mrs. Hartnell's eyes were fixed on him with a kind of eager condemnation. Mrs. Price Ridley sat upright and brisk, like a woman expecting to be consulted. Edna hovered by the door, as if ready to flee at the first sharp word. Dr. Haydock lounged in a corner, detached but attentive. Inspector Beckett opened his notebook. I will speak plainly. We have two connected events, the death of Mrs. Bartlett and the theft of her will. The question is whether they are linked by the same hand, and if so, whose? He paused, perhaps expecting a reaction. None came. It might be useful, Miss Marple said gently, if we begin not with a will but with a pillow. A ripple passed through the room, confusion from some, wariness from others. Mrs. Bartlett, Miss Marple continued, disliked perfume, violet water, orris. Such things made her sneeze. Yet when she was found, her pillow was quite saturated with such a scent. That means one of two things. Either she applied it herself, which is unlikely, or someone else did so after she lay down. And because scent clings and powder leaves traces, the same fragrance was found on the winter pillowcase beneath her head. A winter case in June, taken from the airing cupboard by Harry and Edna, at Mrs. Bartlett's request. Harriet's head came up. She said she was cold. I thought, yes, my dear, quite natural. But you see, winter linens in this house have been stored with perfumed sachets, powdered sachets, and that powder was found, too, on the skirting by the bed, on the carpet, even on the paper of the sachet itself. That told me the killer had leaned over the bed, knees on the carpet, hands steady on the pillow, long enough to apply pressure and still leave the appearance of an untouched death, a nurse's competence, or a housekeeper's, not a man's hasty work. She looked about the room, her mild blue eyes stopping, briefly, on Mrs. Price Ridley. Then there was a letter Mrs. Bartlett received the day she died. Cream paper, a lady's hand, perfumed. Mr. Russell received one, too. Both on Mayfair cream stationery sold in Much Benham. Packets purchased by Harriet, by Dr. Haydock for his patients, and by Mrs. Price Ridley, who, curiously, tried to give one away to Mrs. Clement. Why give away new stationery, unless it had already served its purpose? Mrs. Price Ridley's mouth tightened. I see no harm in... You also keep the same perfumed sachets used in the Harcourt's winter cupboard, Miss Marple interrupted softly. Tom Biddle recalled it. Edna confirmed it, and a scrap of violet tissue, identical to the lining of those sachet boxes, was found by Mrs. Bartlett's bed. The inspector's pencil moved. Then there was a theft, Miss Marple went on. The will vanished from Mrs. Harcourt's desk during the night, the lock force of the silver paper knife. Later found in the hedge with powder traces, and a pale green thread caught in the handle. Harriet, you wore pale green when you went to Mrs. Bartlett's room, but you did not force that lock. Whoever did so had to know the will was there, and had reason to fear its contents, and they had to be inside the house, or have the run of it, long enough to leave unseen. She folded her hands. Mrs. Price Ridley has, for years, taken a keen interest in the affairs of her neighbors. You encouraged Mrs. Bartlett to make changes to her will. Changes which, I think, removed a small but pleasing bequest to a certain charitable fund you administer. Mrs. Bartlett, however, lodged the altered will with Mrs. Harcourt, instead of destroying it. When you learned this, likely through Edna, whom you pressed with questions, you saw a way to remove it, and at the same time to direct suspicion toward Mr. Russell. 2 anonymous letters on the same paper linked you both to Mrs. Bartlett, and after her death, when the police looked no further than an outsider, you had your chance to remove the document altogether. Mrs. Price Ridley's cheeks flushed a mottled crimson. You have no proof of any such. The proof, Miss Marple said, her voice still mild, is in the paper knife. The thread on its handle is from your gardening smock, pale green, worn when you visited Mrs. Harcourt that day to offer help, and in the sachet box in your own parlor. Inspector Beckett has found the corner of a paper identical to the scrap in the Harcourt bedroom. You carried the scent into the room that afternoon, bent over Mrs. Bartlett, and left it behind. For a moment the room was very still. Then Beckett closed his notebook with a quiet finality. Mrs. Price Ridley made a small, sharp sound, a mixture of defiance and resignation, and rose to her feet. If you imagine I will, she began, but Beckett's raised hand cut her off. I think we'll discuss it further at the station, madam. As the inspector escorted her out, Miss Marple turned to Mrs. Harcourt and Harriet, whose faces showed mingled relief and disquiet. It is never pleasant, she said gently, when harm comes from so close to home. But people rarely change their natures, you know. Those who take small liberties often take larger ones when the stakes rise. Mrs. Price Ridley has been acquisitive for years. This time, the prize was simply larger. Later, walking home through the quiet lanes, Miss Marple reflected that the village would settle soon enough. Someone else's small scandal would take its place, and the Bartlett matter would be spoken of less and less, except in kitchens where the scent of orris lingered too long. In her own parlor, she set the kettle to boil and took up her knitting. Human nature, she thought, was much like a skein of wool, full of knots if left untended, but given patience and a steady hand, the tangles could be worked free. And sometimes, when you followed the thread far enough, it led you right back to where you knew it would all along.